Welcome to our deep dive on trauma-informed care. So, today we're going really deep with an academic paper that explores how these principles apply to the workplace. And we also have this training transcript for healthcare providers.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, yeah. Get ready to think about trauma in a way you probably haven't before.
I think it's really interesting how both of these sources emphasize just how common trauma is. We tend to think of it, like these major events, but it's way more prevalent than we realize.
Yeah, the training transcript says that something like 70% of adults in the US have experienced some kind of trauma at some point.
Wow.
That's a really big number. And it makes you think, like, what sorts of experiences are they talking about, and how is this affecting everyone, our communities, our workplaces?
Absolutely. And the way we define trauma is changing too. It's not just about like the event itself.
Right.
It's about, you know, how the individual experiences that event and the lasting effects it has on them.
They both talk about this idea of the three E's of trauma: the event, the experience, and the effect. So basically, you define what's traumatic for you. Someone else doesn't get to decide that for you.
Exactly. And that's so important because it means trauma doesn't discriminate. It affects everyone, no matter their background.
The training transcript had some really powerful examples of this. They talked about a child struggling in school because of something going on at home, a woman missing work because of domestic violence, a veteran using substances to cope with, what they experienced in combat.
Right.
It really shows how trauma can manifest in so many different ways.
Those examples definitely highlight how diverse trauma can be.
Yeah.
And if we think about it on a larger scale, the COVID-19 pandemic, which the academic paper talks about, shows us how widespread trauma can really be. I mean, a lot of us experience that firsthand.
You're right. It affected all of us in some way, and for many people, it was probably a traumatic experience. So where does this leave us then?
Well, it brings us to the bad news. Unaddressed trauma has serious consequences for individuals and for society as a whole.
The training transcript actually links it to things like a higher risk of mental health disorders, substance abuse problems, and even chronic diseases. That was pretty surprising to me to learn about those connections.
Yeah, and the academic paper adds to that, focusing on the economic impact. Did you know that people with PTSD miss an average of 3.6 days of work each month,
I did not.
just in the U.S.? That adds up to about $3 billion in lost revenue.
Wow, that's a huge number. Makes you think about all the ways trauma could be impacting our economy that we don't even realize. But before we get, too stuck on the negative, both sources do talk about some good news.
They do. They talk about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to heal and rewire itself. Pretty amazing, actually.
I really like the analogy the training transcript uses to explain it. They compare neuroplasticity to building new roads in the brain.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, and the more we use those roads, the stronger they get, and eventually the old trauma-impacted roads fade away.
That's a great visual.
It really shows that we're not powerless when it comes to trauma. We can heal and build resilience. And this is where, the concept of trauma-informed care comes in. It's about shifting our perspective. Instead of asking, what's wrong with you, we start asking, what happened to you?
Such an important shift.
Yeah, and the training transcript introduces Samesha's 4 Rs of trauma-informed care: realize the impact of trauma, recognize the signs and symptoms, respond by integrating that knowledge into our practices and policies, and resist re-traumatization.
Right. So it's a whole framework for creating systems and environments that are actually sensitive to the needs of people who have experienced trauma.
Exactly. So, let's go back to that workplace example. Imagine someone who is constantly late coming back from their lunch break. A trauma-informed manager wouldn't automatically discipline them.
Right.
They would approach the situation with curiosity and empathy.
Yeah, they might ask about what's causing those delays. Maybe it's a single parent who has to go across town during lunch to give medication to a sick child. A trauma-informed workplace would understand that and work with the employee to find a solution.
That's a really good example of how these principles can show up in everyday situations.
Yeah.
It's not always about these big gestures, but those small, meaningful interactions. But how do we actually create these trauma-informed systems? It seems like a huge undertaking.
It can feel that way, but both sources offer some models for making it happen.
The academic paper focuses on Bloom's sanctuary model, which has been used since the 1980s.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been used to transform organizational culture in a lot of different places, like healthcare and education.
That's interesting. Tell me more about the sanctuary model.
Well, it focuses on 7 key characteristics of a healthy culture: nonviolence, emotional intelligence, social learning, shared governance, open communication, social responsibility, and a focus on growth and change.
Those sound like, the ingredients for any successful and supportive workplace.
They really do. And then the training transcript talks about Samacha's 6 key principles of trauma-informed care: safety, trustworthiness, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, and respect for cultural differences.
Okay.
And those principles seem to align really well with the sanctuary model.
They do. It's all about creating spaces where people feel safe, supported, and empowered.
And both models emphasize that creating trauma-informed systems is a journey, not a destination.
Right, it takes time.
The academic paper uses the analogy of a marathon, not a sprint.
I like that. It really captures the idea that this is long-term work, not a quick fix.
Right. It's about making fundamental changes in how we approach care and support. It's about creating a culture where healing and well-being are the priority. So what does all of this mean for our listener? Where do they fit into all of this?
That is the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what we'll explore next.
I think the main takeaway is that becoming trauma-informed, it's an ongoing thing, It's about continuously trying to understand trauma better and how it affects people. And then also like developing empathy and compassion, both for ourselves and for others.
Yeah, realizing that everyone has a story. And sometimes that story includes things that have, really shaped them. The training transcript, I thought, did a good job with the examples, the real world's examples. It gave me a better grasp on how trauma actually shows up in different situations throughout someone's whole life.
Absolutely. The example about the kid having trouble focusing in school really stuck with me.
Right.
It's easy to just assume they're being disruptive or lazy or whatever.
Right.
But a trauma-informed approach, it asks, what's going on in this child's life that might be affecting their ability to learn? I thought the same thing. We often don't know what's going on beneath the surface. Maybe they're seeing substance abuse at home or dealing with their parents' divorce, something like that. That kind of trauma can have a huge impact, especially on a child's development.
And it's not just kids. The example about the woman missing Iraq because of domestic violence, that was powerful too. Instead of judging her for not being there, a trauma-informed workplace would recognize that she's probably dealing with really tough circumstances. And they would offer support, resources, help her through it.
It makes you realize how much we might be missing if we don't look at these situations through that trauma-informed lens. It's not about blame. It's about understanding and compassion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's recognizing that people are doing their best with what they've got, and we need to provide the support they need to, heal and actually thrive. What I thought was interesting was how the training transcript also talked about the long-term effects of trauma if it's not addressed. It's not just immediate. It can ripple through a person's entire life.
Yeah, I was struck by how they discussed the ACE study, the one that found a strong link between adverse childhood experiences and all sorts of health problems later on. It really shows that connection between childhood trauma and things like heart disease, cancer, mental health issues, substance abuse, everything.
It's a reminder that the more ACEs a person has, the higher their risk for developing these problems. So early intervention, prevention, that's key. We need to tackle trauma at the source and create systems that help people become resilient.
Yeah.
That help them heal.
It can feel heavy, though, hearing about these long-term impacts. I bet some people listening are thinking, is there any hope?
Right.
But both sources really emphasize that we all have this incredible capacity for healing. They point to neuroplasticity. That's the brain's ability to change and adapt.
Absolutely. That's powerful. The training transcript did a good job of explaining that, comparing it to making new paths in the brain.
Oh, yeah, I like that.
It's like when you're walking through a forest and making a new trail. It's tough at first, but with each step, that path becomes clearer and easier to follow.
Great analogy. And eventually, that old path, the one impacted by the trauma, it fades away. Of course, it takes time and patience and support, but it shows how resilient we are, how we can overcome these things. And that's where those protective factors come in, right?
Yes. Protective factors can make a huge difference. Things like having strong social connections, supportive relationships, a sense of purpose in life. Those can buffer the effects of trauma and build resilience.
And the training transcript also talked about, having access to resources and opportunities, things like safe housing, good education, healthcare. Those things can really help people who have experienced trauma to navigate the challenges and, build a better future.
I agree. It's also important to remember that, especially for people working in helping professions, there's the risk of vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue. It's easy to get overwhelmed, burned out when you're constantly hearing these stories of trauma.
That makes sense. The transcript really emphasizes self-care, especially for those folks on the front lines. It's a way to prevent burnout, secondary traumatic stress, all that. Taking care of ourselves is important so we can keep showing up for others.
Exactly. It's not selfish, it's necessary. So we've talked about the effects of trauma, the power of healing, but how do we actually make these trauma-informed systems happen? Both sources offer some interesting models.
The academic paper dives into Bloom's sanctuary model, the one that's been used since the 80s to create trauma-sensitive places.
Wow, the 80s.
I know. What's cool about the sanctuary model is that it focuses on changing the whole culture of an organization.
Yeah.
It emphasizes these 7 core things: nonviolence, emotional intelligence, social learning, shared governance, open communication, social responsibility, and focusing on growth and change.
That sounds like a pretty solid base for any organization.
Right. And the training transcript highlights SAMHSA's 6 key principles for trauma-informed care: safety, trustworthiness, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, and respect for cultural differences.
I feel like these really align with the sanctuary model. They're all about building trust, a sense of belonging, and empowering people.
They do. It's about creating that sense of community. And something worth pointing out is that both models say this is a journey, not a quick fix. The academic paper even says it can take an organization up to 3 years to really put the sanctuary model into practice.
Wow.
Yeah,
That really highlights that we're talking about big shifts, in how we approach care and support.
exactly. And the training transcript adds that trauma-informed care isn't like a one-size-fits-all solution. It's about finding what works for each individual person.
So what does all this mean for our listener? The takeaway is that becoming trauma-informed, it's a process. It's about continuously learning, reflecting, and taking action, developing that empathy, compassion for ourselves and others, and ultimately creating a world that's more responsive to the needs of people who've been affected by trauma.
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming, but it's important to remember that even small steps can make a difference. And that brings us to a really important point that both sources emphasized: the role of leadership in making these trauma-informed systems a reality.
Yeah, it seems like leadership really is key to making these systems work, really making them trauma-informed.
Absolutely. It starts from the top. Leaders, they set the tone, the whole culture, and they're the ones who can actually put training in place, provide resources, foster that environment of respect and understanding.
The academic paper mentioned that the leaders who successfully implemented the sanctuary model, they often had what they called a transformational leadership style.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like they inspire and motivate their teams to really embrace this new way of thinking and working. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And the training transcript talked about having a specific person, like a trauma-informed champion, on the leadership team, someone who really drives it, make sure those principles are woven into everything the organization does.
That's a cool idea, having a champion for this. But I think it's important to remember that leadership isn't just about titles. It's about each of us stepping up, taking responsibility for creating that positive change.
I totally agree. We can all be leaders, in our own little worlds, our families, our workplaces, our communities. We can start those conversations, challenge those harmful norms, speak up for people who have been marginalized or silenced.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into trauma-informed care, I'm feeling a little bit of both, challenged by what we've learned, but also inspired.
Me too. It's definitely a call to action, to step outside of our comfort zones and see the world in a new way.
To recognize how much trauma impacts everyone, and to work towards a future where healing and resilience are just like the normal way of things.
I think a trauma-informed world is a more just world, a more equitable world, a world where everybody has the chance to thrive.
That's your deep dive, complete. We hope this exploration has given you some new insights, maybe even shifted your perspective a bit. Remember, even those small steps towards being more trauma-informed can create a ripple effect, make a real difference in the world around you. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.